And I'll go ahead and get started. Um, so it's our pleasure to host Ismail Ali today. Um, Ismail is um, the policy director or the advocacy and policy director at MAPS. They have been personally utilizing psychedelics and other substances in celebratory and spiritual contexts for over 15 years and have actively been participating in the drug policy reform movement for a decade. Ismail, um, as I mentioned, is the director of policy and advocacy at MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, um, and co-founded the Psychedelic Bar Association. They advise or are formally affiliated with or serve in leadership positions for a whole bunch of organizations in the drug policy reform ecosystem, including Students for Sensible Drug Policy, the Chacruna Institute, the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, and Alchemy Community Therapy Center, formerly known as the SAGE Institute in the Bay Area. We're thrilled to host Ismail and encourage you to drop your questions in the Q&A box at any time throughout the session. Happy to answer them. So Ismail, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much, Aiden. My sound's okay? Thumbs up from the folks so I can see. Okay, great. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. Appreciate all of the folks. I know that doing webinar panels like this to actually do take some scheduling and planning and structuring. So just shout out to all the folks that are making this series possible. I know that it takes time to lock all this stuff down, so appreciate the effort. It's good to meet you all and not see you all, but like know that you're there. My name is Ismail Ali. I'm excited to have a conversation with you all today, mostly focusing a little bit about history and mostly about the present of the psychedelic policy reform landscape, which is a lot of what I do at MAPS and what I've done over the last decade or so. Today, I'll take a second to introduce myself and give a little bit of a roadmap, tiny bit of history, just to give a little bit of context for those that haven't heard me share about that before. I like to bring not just the 50-year history, but like a rapid version of the 500-year history, because I think it puts the psychedelic policy conversation, even the contemporary one, in better context. And then I'll go a little bit over what has happened in the last really 5 years. I think a lot of you are probably already familiar with it, maybe have been following the news. And I'd like to give just a little bit of a contextualized analysis of where we've been at. And then end with maybe some, I don't know if predictions is the right word, but certainly some thoughts about where we're going and where we'll go from here. I'll leave lots of time at the end for Q&A, and I like to think of myself as highly interruptible. So if you do put questions in the Q&A as we go or in the chat, I'll try to catch them. If I don't, I'll make sure that we make time for that at the end. But I'm good with the kind of dynamism of some interaction. And maybe lastly, I'll say that one thing that would be that if we have time for, that could be particularly useful in the context of this conversation is differentiating the state legal regulated systems and then the FDA approval process or the kind of federally regulated medical system. Because I feel like that's something that's coming up more and more and can be quite confusing. So I'll make sure to touch a little bit about all that. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay, great. So actually, if you don't mind, I'm gonna see if we can start with a moment of mindfulness. It's bright and early here in Oakland, California, where I am. And I know that it's a little bit later in the day for y'all, but maybe you've got your day started. So if you will indulge me, I'd invite you to close your eyes and, or if you're in a place where you can't close your eyes, to maybe just take a second to drop a little bit into your body. Maybe before we start this technical, sweet, heady conversation, take a second to check into your breath. Take a moment to feel whatever you can about the systems working, blood moving, air moving, your skeletal structure, your nervous system, maybe your joints. Just take a moment to bring yourself into the moment, into the space that you're in. Maybe give yourself the slightest bit of permission to just let whatever it is that's happening around you or to you or that you're doing, just fall away for a brief moment here in the middle of our day. A couple breaths all the way down to your feet, all the way to the edges of your hands. I guess those are called fingers. Whenever you're ready, feel free to open your eyes back and come on back. 2-minute micro meditation to keep us in our bodies before this this conversation that's very much in our heads. Okay. So as I mentioned, it's good to meet you all. I'm Ismail. I'm going to give a little bit about my background now, just so you guys have a sense of who's talking to you, and then I'll get into the deep content. So as Aiden said, I play a bunch of different roles in the ecosystem. It's been a blast. I get to have a legal background and spend a good amount of time thinking about the legal and policy strategy questions that are emergent. One of the interesting things about the psychedelic policy field is that the topic, the kind of interaction between the history and the present, I think shows up in a lot of different ways. And one of the reasons I really enjoy the field is because it touches on a lot of different aspects of history and our experience, and often feels very high stakes because it's something that feels very personal to people, and often is because of its impacts, whether it's on mental health or spirituality or something else. I grew up in Fresno, California, in the Central Valley, about equidistant between Los Angeles and San Francisco, for those that aren't familiar. I am Muslim and grew up in the post 9/11 era. My father is Pakistani and my mother is Colombian. So my kind of early political socialization, you might say, was in the post 9/11 tolerance era, as some people call it. I spent a lot of time in that time trying to understand US foreign policy and domestic policy, and how concepts like terrorism and civil liberties and surveillance were navigated in the public eye, in the news, by the government, and so on. And that's kind of where I started my interest in how the world works. That evolved eventually because over the course of my teens and early 20s, I spent time experimenting with different substances in a lot of different environments. And that for a long time was really something that I felt was something very separate, and had to be something very separate from the rest of my life, where I was an athlete and achieving in XYZ ways and interested in these other topics. It was when I was in law school that I really began to put the pieces together, that the global war on drugs, the global drug control system, this like kind of bigger conversation around surveillance and how governments treated their people, incarceration, punishment, crime, that they actually weren't so different. And the kind of pieces started to come together a little over a decade ago for me. And I shifted into working in drug policy while I was still in grad school. So I say this to say that I'll talk about some of the more specific policy details and elements, but I do feel like drug policy, maybe broadly, psychedelic policy, I think also, but drug policy broadly does touch on so many other aspects of the policy landscape, whether it's how we think about work, how we think about housing, how we think about social services, how we think about harm reduction or public health. So that kind of what felt at the time, at least, like all-encompassing nature was a significant motivator to actually get me kind of into thinking about some of these issues over time. Maybe one other thing I'll share is that I have family that have been working in the field, I guess you could say, but really at the intersection of transpersonal therapy and shamanic practice, you could say, or different kinds of traditional practices. for some decades now, and we're students of Claudia Naranjo's, for those who are familiar, Chilean psychotherapist who passed away in 2019, I want to say, 2019. So I say that to say that like my kind of impression and personal opinion about a lot of this is both shaped by kind of my understanding of that history as well as my own kind of study and research. So that's a little bit about my worldview. I'm happy to talk more about that, but I'll start there because I want people to know kind of where I'm coming from. I think that there's a lot of cosmologies and ideologies that motivate how we think about what the world should become. And I like kind of putting some of that out front, just to offer people as much context as I can for myself and where I'm coming from. Because I think so much of how we think about that is defined by how we see the world, what we think is real, and so on. So I'm going to give a really, really, really fast overview of my kind of perspective of the history of drug use in particular and psychedelics, because I think that giving this context kind of beyond the capital W, capital D war on drugs is quite significantly helpful in understanding how we make decisions today. And the key takeaway will be that the decisions we're making about psychedelic drug policy may not be able to use the same logic that we've been using or that we think we need to use with respect to decisions around the broader war on drugs, i.e. the kind of system of mass incarceration. So I'll get to that in a second. So super brief history of global drug control, 1500s to present, maybe a little bit later than that. Essentially, the process of settling the quote unquote New World in the 1600s had, as a lot of you, probably everybody here learned in high school and beyond, had all these different elements of influence from the church, influence from governments, and so on. One of the key elements that I think a lot of people in this field have started to understand, have heard, but maybe don't know all the details of, is that while we do talk about the history of psychoactive plants and fungi, psilocybin mushrooms, poppies, peyote, cannabis, and their use throughout human history for healing, cultural, communitarian, sacramental, and political purposes, what I think some people miss is that that role, that significance of these plants, of these tools, was quite clear to the people who were settling the quote unquote New World from the very beginning. We have writings now that show, there are writings that show that awareness of some of the importance of these plant practices culturally was clear very early. And the reason I bring that up is because the beginning of prohibition, as we know it today, the beginning of kind of restricting access to psychedelic substances, entheogenic substances, plant-based substances, actually started 500 years ago. And the fact that these substances often had this kind of central cultural role in a number of, not every culture, of course, but in many of these traditions, means that the kind of slow eradication or removal of those from society was part of a larger arc of cultural erasure, genocide, colonization, and so on. So I start there because the prohibition of psychedelics today, which to us looks very different from the prohibition of something like cannabis, methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine, all of which have very high numbers of individuals incarcerated in state and federal contexts for those uses, for those substances, is not quite comparable. A lot of us know this, that the arrest rate, that the rate of law enforcement resources, you could say, in general, spent on psychedelic prohibition or criminalization is significantly limited. We actually don't have huge numbers of people who've been impacted by psychedelic prohibition that are currently in that state. Now, this is not to underplay the fact that people do get arrested, people do go to jail, people do have permanent consequences, family separation, and so on, for crimes related to these issues. But the reason I start here is because understanding that the prohibition or the criminalization of the restriction of these practices started so much longer ago, that a lot of that had already been kind of leached, removed, or separated from society, or put underground by the time the kind of modern era of drug control began. So it's like really not till the late 1880s, like maybe mid 1800s, early 1900s, that the legal and economic control over psychoactive substances that we know today, the global drug control system, begins to take shape. So this like shift in geopolitical structures, there's kind of this limitation and eradication in the early 1600s. There was then about a couple hundred years at least of trade between mostly what kind of large Western European powers with different substances, some of which we know, alcohol, caffeine. But it really wasn't until the late 1800s or so, early 1900s, that the geopolitical structures that were put in place partially by some of this colonial infrastructure that was built over the course of those hundreds of years set groundwork for the current drug control scheme that we kind of see as being the standard. All that to say that drug prohibition in its current form is really a minority. It's a blip, you could say, in history. Most of human history has had some element of trade or some element of actual like interaction between cultures, people, and these drugs. And in many cases, as I'm sure a lot of you have seen those images of, the late 1800s, early 1900s medicine bottles that have like morphine, cannabis, cocaine, alcohol. It's like all, so we've thought a lot and engaged very differently with drugs and their uses over time. So the reason I give this kind of little mini spiel at the beginning is to contextualize that when we think about psychedelic policy reform, whether it's decriminalization or legalization or regulated adult use at the state level, or even medical access through the FDA, we're doing this in this context of hundreds of years of a particular arc of global drug control that is starting to shift a bit as kind of we get more information, as more information is shared, and as social stigma and kind of general political openness begins. I'll talk a little bit more later about how it might be helpful to think about something like LSD or MDMA, kind of more modern synthetic drugs in that arc. But if that's something that people would like me to go more into, I'm happy to do that later on. So it wasn't really till the 1940s, 1960s that the current global prohibition of psychoactive substances, as we understand it, is woven into the creation of the United Nations. And by 1961, we have a convention that kind of globally controls drugs broadly. Of course, research is happening at the same time. And it's interesting to think in particular about like the 40s, 50s, 60s, the kind of increase in psychedelic research with the beginning of the restriction of that kind of political aspect of it. It really wasn't until the late 60s, early 70s that prohibition in that format crystallizes into what we know today as the war on drugs. That's when you have the social and racial discrimination, the profiling, the quashing of scientific inquiry, and of course, the billions of dollars spent, millions of people killed, separated from their families, and so on over the course of the war on drugs. But other people have said more about that as well. I just wanted to give this like context so people have a little bit of that. I think that often we do associate, well, psychedelics are illegal drugs, so they're part of this thing. And it's true, and it's helpful to actually understand what's similar and different. And if we want at the end, we can talk a little bit about this concept of psychedelic exceptionalism and how to think about drug policy decisions through the context of what kind of drug it is. But I want to give a little bit of an overview first. So maybe before going into more details, again, if this is really one-on-one, you can feel free to flag it. But I do feel like the misunderstandings persist about the differences between like decriminalization, legalization, medicalization, these different systems. So I'll give a brief overview of what those three systems are, or those are 3 or 4 kind of different ways of thinking of kind of legal structures of psychedelic use are, and then we can go beyond from there. So I'll start with decriminalization because I think that this word gets thrown around a lot and isn't super well understood. Decriminalization really just refers to the reduction or elimination of criminal penalties. In that way, it's exactly what it sounds like. The confusing thing is that it can be done in different ways. So in other words, the levers, you could say, that impact criminalization show up in enforcement and in the law, and also in kind of other kinds of social structures. And the reason I start here is because there has been a lot of really amazing news of cities, municipal kind of jurisdictions decriminalizing substances, often in those cases because criminal law is actually held mostly, the role of criminal law is mostly held at the state level. There are, of course, federal elements, but a lot of the drug enforcement actually happens at the state level. And what that means is that cities, municipalities, what they can do, and what a lot of these cities have done over the last number of years, is basically drop the use or possession, or in some cases, cultivation of some of these substances, mostly psilocybin, sometimes others in other cases, to the lowest law enforcement priority. So it's kind of like effective or practical decriminalization because in practice, the relevant enforcement agencies may not be utilizing resources to go after people, but the law that criminalizes the behavior is now removed from the books, is not. And I bring that up because we actually are, I think that one could say that the two most significant bills that have emerged about decriminalization specifically at the state level are going to be Measure 110, which was passed alongside, at the same time, I should say, as the same time as Measure 109 in Oregon in 2020. Measure 110 decriminalized the personal use of a number of substances, including psilocybin. And Measure 109 created what we now know as like the psilocybin services program in the state of Oregon. And I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. But I start there because that is one example. And then the other is that Colorado's Prop 122, which also is in the process, really in the pre-implementation process now of creating a regulated adult use program, also decriminalize the personal use and non-commercial sharing of a number of these substances. But those are the two most significant examples so far for that state level decriminalization, even while we have quite a bit of movement that's happened at the municipal level over time. And for those that are following the news, you might have seen that there's places, including in some of those cities, that some enforcement has nonetheless happened, either from state or federal agencies, because whatever it is that's happening is kind of outside the bounds of what's protected. Open sales, at least characterized as open sales, or other kinds of things. So I say that to say that decriminalization kind of opens up a channel of access or a channel of behavior that then is like legally protected, or at the very least, like legally kind of staying out of the way of. But only offers protection for kind of that series of behaviors, generally focused on kind of non-commercial, personal, community level work. One could say that spiritual practice often falls under decriminalization, or could, but also spiritual practice kind of has its own carved out protections in the states, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Next, I want to talk a little bit about this term legalization, because people use it a lot. It's far too broad, in my humble opinion. It basically, one way to describe it is that it's really just a system in which any elements are regulated to some extent by state actors. I like to say that decriminalization might create like a little island of legal behavior in a sea of illegal behavior. So you still got to get to the island to get to the thing. You got to do all kinds of illegal stuff. Legalization theoretically creates a system in which you actually have either licenses or certifications or some sort of aspect from the state that's kind of like all encompassing, and that kind of one legal word one might use is cognizes, like actually like wraps its mind around the behavior, whether it's manufacture or cultivation or trade or any elements of that. So as you can kind of maybe understand, legalization is actually quite a broad term that does cover things like the regulated programs in Oregon and Colorado, and it covers medicalization, medical use, which is, I would say, is a restricted form of a legal framework. So that doesn't mean legalization doesn't mean legal for all. It means legal for some class. And that can look like different things in different ways. But the term is slippery because it's really a catch-all for so many things, or can be. I imagine that some of you maybe are most familiar with this kind of process of medicalization. This is the process that MAPS and formerly MAPS PBC, now Lycos, have been on for the last number of years, which is really utilizing the country's medical legal infrastructure. In our case, the Controlled Substances Act, medical regulations, these kind of different systems to create a channel of access through a medical system. And that's characterized by different things in different places, but for us, that usually means some element of quality control, some level of oversight, supervision, training, and in the case of psychedelic medicalization at this time, likely a diagnosis of some kind. So it actually kind of is emerging in the treatment of a disease or treatment of a condition, which is a little bit different from what I was talking about before: personal use, spiritual use, these kind of other elements that may also have a distinct purpose, but may not have a distinct purpose that's like a diagnosable thing in some paradigm. So I start with that as like just kind of the differentiation. And maybe really quickly, I'll say it's important to note like religious practice or spiritual practice. It's one of the channels that I think a lot of people also have psychedelic experiences or seek psychedelic experiences. The religious use is an interesting one because in the United States, there are specific protections for religions, as a lot of you know, between the First Amendment and RFRA, these other kind of elements. Generally, that's historically been associated with like Western, I guess you could say, monotheistic religious practice. Christianity is sort of the blueprint, whether we like it or not, legally speaking. But it can, I think, ought to, and is increasingly, I think, slowly but surely encompassing tribal, native, or indigenous practices. Easier on, there's a spectrum there. So like a U.S. indigenous hybrid church, like the Native American church, has pretty explicit protections, whereas like the kind of traditional spiritual practice of a different tribe from a different part of the world might not have any sort of like frame of recognition, or maybe harder to do so. So religious use is kind of a term of art in this case, in the sense that it means a particular carve out of protection, but people often use it interchangeably with like spiritual practice. Spiritual, I would say, is, as it's its own rabbit hole of a conversation, but it's kind of like, that's kind of a broader definition that may include religion as far as like a system that encompasses a worldview and a cosmology and has doctrine of some kind. Or I think one could argue that religious use or religious practice expands beyond. The law may or may not see it that way, and that's kind of part of some of the conversations that are happening and some of the litigation that's happening and some of the efforts that are happening to recognize religious spiritual practice, not just as extensions of practice that has already existed, but also more and more this kind of emergence of syncretic or hybrid religious and spiritual practices that are really emerging very rapidly in the psychedelic field. So that's a little bit of an overview on kind of the general, I guess you could say, the landscape of the concepts. And what I'll do now for the next few minutes, and then I'll get into questions, is talk a little bit about where we're at today. Let me just check if there's any Q&A that I'm missing so far. Oh, I love that. Okay, yes, I'm pretty optimistic. I'm getting more optimistic also as the day goes by. Usually what happens. But yeah, like I said, I'm glad, because in some ways, maybe as just a quick response to that, in some ways, looking at history is not, it can be hard to be optimistic looking at certain aspects of history. It can be hard to be optimistic looking at the world right now. So I hope that, and I part of the thing that I think keeps me interested in this particular topic and kind of like engage with this particular shade or this particular sliver of this work is that we have really shifted from all of this conversation, with the conversation that we're about to have over the next 5 minutes, about where we're at today. That was really just a theory for a long time, a long time. A lot of people have held this vision for a long time. And maybe now I'll note that like I'm talking about this through the lens of like Western legal thought and analysis. That's like the training that I have. But there's a lot of different ways to look at history. Which maybe if there's one takeaway, it's that there's a lot of different ways to look at history and a lot of different ways to kind of incorporate our own cosmologies and understandings of reality into these like very practical questions. Anyway, I won't go off on the soapbox, but we can talk more about it at the end. So talking a little bit about the modern era of policy change as we understand it. Excuse me. As I mentioned, 2020 was a big year. It was the year that Oregon voters approved measures to decriminalize all drugs with Measure 110, and also develop state legal access to psilocybin services. This is the term that's used in the bill, and regulated centers. A similar bill passed in 2022, like I mentioned earlier. And those two, I mean, where Oregon's, both of these bills had 2-year kind of pre-implementation periods. Oregon is at the beginning of their second year of actual implementation. So that's to say that they had a 2-year pre-implementation period, and then have, as of last year, been kind of like in the ramp up of the program itself. I heard from a colleague that works in the state that about 1,000 people have gone through the services by the end of last year, by the end of 2023. With that number likely increasing as more centers and practitioners get online. So I think that we'll learn a lot. part of I think the interesting thing about this time is that we're learning a lot very quickly, even in the rulemaking process, like knowing what are the rules that one has to, like, what are the things that need to be regulated by a state in a question like this. There's a certain amount that can be, that was thought through beforehand. And then I think when the panel started to get into the rulemaking process in Oregon, they were like, whoa, there's actually a lot of aspects that maybe aren't covered by the legislation itself, by the language of the initiative that was passed. And in order for this program to function, we needed to sort through those. So there was I would say, a big, and I think very valuable learning curve in that process initially. I served on the social equity subcommittee for about 20 months, which reviewed many of the proposals that were being put forward and thought through the questions of like, how do we make sure that this is as equitable as possible, which looks at like financial accessibility, cultural relevance, a lot of other elements to be like, if we are going to make this type of activity, this type of service available, how do we make sure that it's available as broadly as possible? And there are more questions, I think, to talk about with respect to equity and access that we can get into if we'd like to at the end. Meanwhile, we're starting to see the cities consider drug policy reforms, federal funding beginning to trickle through. There's probably other people that could talk a little bit more and better about that, but the end of last year and the beginning of this year really saw some big shifts with respect to the kind of funding landscape, both at the state level, which money started coming out, was starting getting kind of let go by state or kind of offered by states in the last few years through state level reforms, mostly for research and pilot programs, but we're starting to see some movement from the federal government as well. We're now at a very interesting place. Maybe actually two more things actually about this kind of overview. One is that like in the wake of, you might say, Oregon and Colorado, 2023 was a really big year. There were well over 20 bills that were introduced across the country. Again, I'm talking about state level programs now, about 20 plus bills that were introduced across the country, everything from just creating task forces. Hey, let's like get some experts to look into something, to kind of going for decriminalization of some personal possession amount, to some other legal program like a regulated access program, what we see in Colorado and Oregon, and then kind of larger scale decrim like what we were doing in California with SB 519 and 58. I say that to say that the kind of breadth of the type of policy solutions that are being put forward for different problems is quite wide. And so the two bills, notably Colorado and Oregon's adult use bills, were both passed with kind of citizen-led initiatives or voter referendums. They use different language in different states, but basically that question was put to the voters directly, not through the legislature. So it wasn't through representatives; it was to the voters, and the voters put on their ballot yes or no, and those two passed. The reason I bring that up is because last year, in my opinion, was like the testing ground, you could say, for the legislative pathway for a lot of these questions. So in other words, the psychedelic policy proposals that are being engaged with now and over the course of last year were overwhelmingly put in front of legislatures. And the logic of convincing or working with a legislature and representatives is a bit different than the logic of working directly in a citizen-led initiative. It's like, are you trying to convince the public, or are you trying to convince the person who represents you, who has their own interests, their own constituents, is probably looking for re-election, all these other factors. So that's kind of been an interesting shift in the landscape where, of course, there are still things that are going to be going forward through the referendum process, including, I think, Massachusetts. I think there's a couple others that we're going to see on the table this year. But I say that to say that the idea, the zeitgeist, you could say, the excitement about the psychedelic field and this expansion is definitely hitting a lot of corners of society. And it's possible that it's hitting kind of like the public, or certain elements, I should say, definitely not the whole public, but certain demographics of the public or certain elements of the public faster and in a more excitable sort of way than it's hitting people who are necessarily, representing their constituents. The political aspects that I think are different for different kind of voters or different actors. And that's, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think that there's a certain level where that balance allows for some equilibrium between like the hype and the hysteria, like people being a little too evangelical, a little too excited. And we can talk a little bit about that, because I think that level of not just excitement is great, optimism is great, we love it. But I do think that there at times can be a lack of groundedness, both in the policy field, but really in the field in general, that comes again, I think, from people's excitement, the response to the desperation of the need. There's a lot of reasons that people are really excited about this topic. And I think maintaining a certain level of equanimity, or at least some level of balance, and kind of holding that these are powerful tools that may benefit some people, maybe benefit a lot of people, but also are very powerful tools with a tremendous impact on our psyche and on ourselves, and really our society throughout history. I like to think of psychedelics as tools for meaning making. I think that there's a lot of things they do, non-specific amplifiers, they do this and that, but I think that they're tools for meaning making. And I think that makes them very powerful, but also means that we we need to be careful not to kind of frame them as like silver bullet solutions, or it's also a crazy term to use for something like that. But you know, as anything more than what they are. And that I think part of this kind of conversation about responsible use and safety does need to bring in some of these elements of hype. And of course, balancing that with like the history of propaganda that we've gotten, not just again for the last 50 years, but the 500 years of propaganda that certain people, diasporic identities, people like my own ancestors were told like, hey, your traditional practices are not right. They're not okay. So there is a balance there, I think, to be holding. And I think that part of, again, going back to the optimism is that I think that it's getting easier and easier to understand both that our understanding of history, our understanding of our culture is more nuanced than we're taught by the state, by the current kind of powers, and that not to get so carried away that we are ungrounded in our analysis. I don't think being like evangelical, to use one word, or kind of proselytizing about this work, about these substances, is necessarily always the fit. I do think that having some sort of balance is really, really important. And one, you know, and I think how we get to safety, responsibility, compassionate, you know, policy, I think differs. I think different people have different perspectives on like how to get to safety. I think that harm reductionists and prohibitionists both think that they are going for that their goal is safety, but we have different opinions about how to achieve that. And going back to the beginning, as a person who grew up in and around drug culture, I can see how the norms that we built in to, or how we taught children, how we taught my generation, how to think about drugs was part of the reason they were so dangerous for us. And I hope that as we move forward with whatever the actual policy solution is, whether it's understanding, you know, creating protection for religious practice or adult use or whatever it is, that when we think about safety, that we actually learn from the lessons, especially the last, you know, 40, 50 years, and our assumptions of how we think about drugs and behavior and so on. I think we're learning a lot, and I think it'd be valuable to incorporate those learnings and lessons. And maybe I'll close by just saying at least this section, by saying that one exciting thing about the psychedelic policy field is that it's moving fast, and it's also learning fast. Some of the fast movement is a little bit scary and can be kind of intense, because it's like, well, how do we know when to move forward with new information? And yet I do see a lot of people who are seeing, okay, here are the decisions that were made in the creation of the cannabis movement and industry that we kind of maybe need to correct or change. Or maybe this is something that we see that we want to do differently, or we can see how this could change the infrastructure of what healthcare or something else. So I think that like possibility is also really exciting, and needs to be grounded in like, well, what are the kind of medium, long-term goals that we actually have? Like, how do we do whatever we can to reduce just this powerful tool becoming just another product, just another consumer item? And that doesn't mean that we have to control it in a particular way necessarily. I think reasonable people can disagree on what the actual framework should look like. But I think having a lot of humility, spaciousness to learn as we go and to understand what those systems look like, especially in an environment with so much suffering. There's more to say about that, but like because this kind of awareness of mental health and our own personal kind of existential suffering and what's happening around the world and at home, it demands a level of rigor from us as people in the field, as advocates, to be like, hey, how can these actually be implemented in a responsible way, and not used to kind of further throw off the precious balance that we're trying to regain here together. That was a little bit more esoteric than I intended at the end, but I hope that all fit at least some level of an arc. I just spieled a lot. I think I talked for almost 40 minutes straight. So I'll pause here maybe and take a breath and see if there's any kind of questions or things that were touched on that would be helpful or interesting to go deeper into. And I would say, and even if there's something that wasn't directly touched on, but you feel like is adjacent, like I'm down to go in any direction. So thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we really appreciate it. And please, yeah, if people want to put their questions in the Q&A, we can invite you up, and you can have some face-to-face time. But I have a question actually that was coming up for me a little bit earlier in your talk. I was wondering, one of the avenues of decriminalization that you were talking about is sort of just it being like not a priority to enforce, but technically against the law. And I was
Mhm.
wondering if there's any danger there or not, that it might leave room for like for enforcement to just kind of decide and might be biased, or it might be like the whims of a particular person in power, and if we need to think about that at all.
It's a very good question. It's been one of the reasons that been I've been really excited about the movement to kind of decriminalize or deprioritize at the local level. And your question is exactly where most of my skepticism or concern has lied, which is I don't think that the average person necessarily understands or frankly needs to understand some of the kind of nuances of how law is enforced. Of course, it's good to know, and like I would say an important part of like civic engagement to understand that, but just using another like very simple example that's often used in this context is like jaywalking. People are like, okay, jaywalking is technically illegal in many places, but it's the lowest law enforcement priority. In practice, like it's not a problem, but they could use it if they needed to. You know, it's kind of a tool that's still in the toolkit that's like staying in the holster also.
Yeah.
But to your question, yeah, I've been encouraged to see over the last, I think that Denver and Oakland passed their deprioritization in it was like May and June 2019 respectively. So we're going on almost 5 years in those cities at least, and there's other cities that have like 2, 3+ years where generally speaking, it seems to have held, where most of the local law enforcement at least has in fact stayed outside of the range of those behaviors or outside of the range of those kind of activities. And like I mentioned, because to your point, it's not fully decriminalized at the state level, you still have some scenarios where state law enforcement are going in because they're like, hey, you're actually not, you're actually like have some sort of commercial element of this practice or something that's too large of a scale or something.
Mhm.
So I think it's really important to, I think one of the biggest benefits of decriminal or deprioritization is that it opens up room for community to feel less stigmatized. One huge benefit to that is that it allows for like community groups or like integration circles or these kind of auxiliary services and safety nets and things that I think are really important in building kind of a healthy psychedelic community can emerge because they feel safer and maybe more protected in the context of like that decriminalization where it's like, okay, at least we like know it's a thing, we can talk about it sort of openly. And I think that the one of the risks there, yeah, is that if the average consumer or participant doesn't understand that they might be putting themselves in legal risk they're not fully consenting to by participating, which is why, and I don't think that's necessarily like the end of the world. I just think that that kind of thing should be disclosed and understood as much as possible. I also think that talking about some of these legal issues, policy issues, is a form of like legal harm reduction. It also, I think, helps us as individuals help understand how to navigate our setting, our time and place, how we relate to some of these issues. So I'm really just like pro literacy, you know, obviously like reading, like pro understanding these systems as much as possible. Some of them are confusing intentionally. Some of them are hard to kind of like tease through, like trying to read an 80-page bill, be like, what does this actually do? And to the extent that, you know, conversations like this and kind of conversations amongst each other can be informative, I'm like, as long
Yeah.
as we approximate that.
Yeah, I guess going along the same lines, I'm even just thinking like if a patient comes and is like, talking about their use or their upcoming use or something, like, is it still, I guess, say in New York City, is it still like, should we be warning them, by the way, obviously I'm non-judgmental, but like you're putting yourself in danger for like legal consequences, or is that not like, what is the actual danger for just a person like using, I don't know, psilocybin like with a friend on a Saturday?
Yeah, I'm gonna give a general answer, not a specific one, because one could give a specific answer to this question with the right facts and context. But I'm through the lens of your question, like especially working with patients or clients who are like, hey, I'm interested, like I'm thinking about this thing. I think that as long as people are aware, I think the biggest thing to communicate is that there is still a gap between the hype that's being presented in the media and the reality of what resources are available, information is available, safety and protection is available. So maybe one like simple way to describe what I'm saying is that the pace of the media hype is, or sorry, yeah, the media hype is outpacing like the social legal infrastructure, and one might say the medical infrastructure, the care infrastructure that we have to like really properly support like a lot of people using psychedelics in different ways. So, and I think that's the biggest thing, that there's like a discrepancy there. I think like what you specifically like advise a client, both from whether it's a medical professional perspective or in my case, like a legal perspective, I think obviously depends on the details. But I do think people should know that um, a lot of these substances are still illegal, even though a lot of amazing policy advancements are happening, a lot of medical policy advancement or medical advancements, and that is like a lot of stuff is happening very quickly. And a lot of the groundwork, I would say, for what I like to describe as like a post-prohibition paradigm is being laid right now. And I think when we can imagine into, and many of us in the advocacy world are imagining into, like what's the thing we'd like to go to. When, you know, especially a lot of my colleagues like work directly with clients in a lot of different contexts, like that's the thing they most often have to remind folks of, which is that like your great business idea, your great XYZ idea, like super cool, maybe possible when we have infrastructure for it. It's not now. So
Yeah.
there is this kind of complexity around working in like a certain gray area. Yeah. Which I think is hard for some people.
Yeah. Thank you.
Did that answer your question? I mean, I was pretty vague. It's
I
like,
mean, I think that's
you
the
like it enough?
reality, you know,
Yeah.
like, but we have to stay with that uncertainty. But well, thank you.
Yeah.
I think Aiden has some questions too. Oh, sorry. I don't know if you'd.
Oh no, I was just saying, I like what you said, like the uncertainty. I think that to me, it's like as long as no one is my main what's the word I'm looking for? My main like gripe, I guess you could say, is like whenever I hear anyone express like a lot of certainty about something, I get suspicious in this field. It's like there's so many moving pieces, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Humility is good. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, echoing Lauren, thanks so much for the talk. We have one question from the audience. Christian asks if you can comment on the federal landscape in a little bit more detail. For example, maybe there's potential future FDA approval for some therapies like MDMA that might require DEA rescheduling. What does that mean, and what are the downstream implications, especially for clinicians?
I'd be happy to talk about that. That is, yeah, a great question, big question. I'll touch on a couple aspects of it. So quick update for those that haven't seen the new drug application that was submitted by Lykos PBC was accepted by the FDA. That announcement came out on Friday. They give us a date of August something, I think in the fall, for that kind of timeline, which is very exciting. There's also movement happening and research that continues to happen with psilocybin in different forms and so on. So we are now looking at like a prospective horizon of potentially FDA approved psychedelic drugs. I mostly avoided talking about that today because of because there is such a difference in many ways between that kind of system and the state regulated system as I was describing. But one of the biggest questions I would say is how those two interact and will interact and may interact and do interact. So the first question was about the federal system, and there was an element. Could you repeat just the first part?
Yeah, I think specifically like whether FDA, how the FDA and DEA are working together.
And the scheduling, yes.
Reschedule, if they refuse to, what happens then?
Yeah, so this is one of those like super fun niche issues that I just did not know existed until I started studying it. But okay, so Rapid Fire Controlled Substances Act, 5 schedules based on different factors. What drug falls in what schedules depend on different factors. Most psychedelics, many drugs that may or may not be considered psychedelic but fall into that category, including MDMA, fall under Schedule 1. Schedule 1 is defined as drugs that have, among other definitions, no accepted medical use. That factor of medical use is determined by Health and Human Services and FDA, in part through its kind of clinical trials process. So the only thing that can kind of affect that lever the analysis for whether or not something has accepted medical use is whether or not the FDA has analyzed it and made a determination there. So one can extrapolate that the decision, if made by the FDA or a regulatory agency to say like, hey, this has medical value. In the US, it's the FDA. The assumption there is like, okay, if a decision is made, then it no longer qualifies for Schedule 1 because that element does not have any accepted medical use, no longer applies because there is in fact an agency that's saying, hey, this does have medical use. The confusing thing and the super fun thing that I think a lot of folks in the psychedelic field are navigating right now is this question of what we call bifurcated scheduling, which is when the drug in its uncontrolled form stays in one schedule while the drug product, which is the term of art used for the kind of entire package that FDA approves, ends up in another schedule. So the kind of common example here is cannabis, which is a Schedule 1 plant, which contains THC and CBD and other cannabinoids, while there are cannabinoid-derived drugs, including CBD-derived or THC-derived drugs in the schedules that are not in Schedule 1, so like Marinol, Dronabinol, Epidiolex, Schedule 3 and 5. That's a situation where you have like the kind of underlying constituents of a substance that end up in a schedule that's not the schedule that the kind of whole version might be. So I could imagine a version of reality where if there were to be approval of something like MDMA or psilocybin or LSD or really anything else for that matter, that even if a drug product is found to have medical use by the FDA, it's that drug product that we place in the schedule other than Schedule 1, while the underlying one could stay in that original schedule. Interestingly, what's criminalization and criminal penalties don't always necessarily track with the schedules. Like there's some drugs that are Schedule 2 that have very high like enforcement, you could say prioritization. A lot of resources are put toward enforcing them or enforcing the illegal use of it. So that's one interesting kind of element where the like the resources that are put towards something or the amount that something is criminalized, like doesn't perfectly track with the schedules. It does overall, but you see like lots of huge exceptions, like more than half of the United States now has some sort of medical or adult use marijuana program, even though cannabis stays in Schedule 1. And the states are saying, well, this probably has medical value, but it hasn't been figured out by the FDA. So there's a lot of places where you have kind of this sort of like liminal state where drugs are existing in multiple categories at once, some of which contradict each other. And I think that's just a matter of like the reshuffling that we're kind of in right now. But the big picture is that like if there were to be FDA approval, that system would kind of roll out through the current pharmaceutical infrastructure, which involves like licensed healthcare providers and insurance and other kinds of agencies. The biggest, and maybe this is like a decent place to almost wrap the conversation today, I think the biggest open question right now is what will be the interaction between these state legal programs if they continue to exist, or decriminalized environments and these regulated environments that are regulated through a medical system. Like maybe a little spiel to close us out is that my personal approach is one that's focused on harmonization. I think that different types of people need different types of environments and benefit from different types of environments. I think of lots of on-ramps, lots of off-ramps. If you're having health or other kinds of problems, there should be lots of opportunities and lots of ways to get support for that. And if you're seeking support through working with substances, there should be different options for that, I think, for different kinds of people. I like to joke that people who go to like shamanic practitioners in the jungle or the desert, they will not go to a psychiatrist unless they absolutely have to. And a lot of people go to psychiatrists are not going to go out to the middle of the desert to find somebody, and it's a little tongue in cheek, but it's true. Like different people really do need different kinds of support. So I feel like, I guess the takeaway here is that having some sort of like quality controlled medical system with all of the accoutrements of like a healthcare infrastructure, I think is really valuable for certain people. And I think that maintaining an ongoing commitment to other kinds of policy reform and harmonizing those together is actually the way to like break through into this, again, post-prohibition world that I think is possible and actually could be safer, could be more responsible, could be more compassionate, while also creating more access to these powerful tools for the right environments, the right people.
That's great. Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you thanks again for coming to speak with us and for ending on such an optimistic note. I really appreciated it, and I hope all our attendees did too.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation. I hope that was interesting. I'm looking, well, we can be in touch after about all of the details of the recording and everything. But yeah, thanks again. Have a fantastic day. Really appreciate the time.